that you are still with us for the case study. What we have looked at so far in my module is the frontier of survival still advancing. We looked at rather success story. We have seen that life expectancy has been increasing on a global and on a local level almost everywhere. We have seen that the inequality in the age at death has been also, at least for the high income countries we looked at, been steadily decreasing. Now I want to look at something which is maybe not such a success story. And this is the impact of the pandemic on longevity trends. What will be the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on life expectancy throughout the world? And my opinion, it will be minor. There will be very, very little impact in the long term. And let me briefly outline why I think so. And there's three reasons I want to give. There are three reasons. Number one, it's the past experience. If you look at the years, and this is again data from the Human Mortality Database, for countries which were available at the time, left panel is women, right panel is men, and we have the abbreviation, so CHE is Switzerland, Denmark, England and Wales, Spain, Finland, France, Iceland, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, New Zealand, the non-Maori population, Scotland and Sweden. So those are the data we have available. And I looked at the years 1910 until 1930, so plus minus 10 years surrounding the so-called Spanish flu pandemic. And what can we see for men? If you look at the green curves and the kind of turquoise color, like Italy, like France, life expectancy dropped from about 50 years to below 30 years. But already before the pandemic, you know, of course, what has happened, World War I, 1914 until 1918. So we should not only look at those countries which were heavily affected, especially men during that time, but also at other countries like the kind of violet color, New Zealand, non-Maori, which were the leaders in terms of life expectancy at the time. We see this kind of steady increase in life expectancy for women and men in most of the countries. And we see a sudden drop in terms of life expectancy in the year 1919 and surrounding weeks and months due to the Spanish flu. If you remember how big the declines were in life expectancy the past 3 years, you see already something which I will also cover on the next slide. The impact of the past pandemic, the Spanish flu about 100 years ago, was devastating, especially after World War I in many countries, where we have declines to 25, 26 years of life expectancy only. And that's why, despite the sad and problematic issue of a pandemic, we also see a silver lining on the horizon, because the impact of the pandemic was extremely, extremely short. You see, after 3-4 years, there's a strong rebound and life expectancy kept on improving on the same level and going upwards like the past trend predicted. We can look at Sweden, we can look at many other countries. You see, even in those countries like Italy, which were like devastating, like France, World War I plus Spanish flu pandemic, an extremely quick rebound. The levels of life expectancy were exceeded 5-10 years at the latest after the end of the pandemic. So that's number one, why I think that the impact of the pandemic on longevity trends will be rather limited. Number two, the magnitude. I already said that the declines in life expectancy we have observed nowadays are minor compared to the life expectancy declines we have observed about 100 years ago. I wasn't alive at that time, but I guess you know what I mean. What can we see? I presented beforehand this kind of decomposition where we can disentangle which ages contributed to the change in life expectancy. And I have here women in New Zealand, men in New Zealand. So this is the world record holder, so the best practice country. And on the right-hand side, we have women and men in Germany, where we compare 2019 with 2021. Usually we have improvements in life expectancy, so the sum of those columns should be more positive. But nowadays, or not here in this case of a pandemic, we see, no surprise, columns going down, which means that life expectancy has been declining. We actually have seen a decline in infant survival, so an improvement for infants. But then we see that life expectancy declines, which we have observed also for New Zealand, were driven by rather young people. And if we switch to the right-hand side, for women and men in Germany, during the past pandemic, it has been driven mainly by older people. Declines in life expectancy were driven by worsening survival conditions for women and men at ages 60, 70 and above. So we have a different age pattern, but what I say here in point number 2 is the magnitude. And how do you recognize the magnitude to compare the Spanish flu with the COVID-19 pandemic? I superimpose the results for Germany, women and men, on top of those results for New Zealand. So the red columns here are exactly the same as the columns here, but put on the same scale. You see 0.01, 0.1. It's an order of magnitude already here larger, the display. And you see how absolutely minor the impact of the pandemic was from the last few years, as bad as it was. And I don't want to like play it down. Many families' lives, the economies, societies were heavily affected by the pandemic and the circumstances surrounding it. But compared to the Spanish flu, in terms of the death toll, this has been thankfully, absolutely minor. And despite, I go back one slide, despite those much larger declines in life expectancy about 100 years ago, nevertheless, mortality, life expectancy rebounded extremely quickly. So the past experience tells us extremely quick rebound. It's compared to the Spanish flu, where we saw that life expectancy was quickly again on the same levels. Compared to the Spanish flu, the magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic was absolutely much smaller, thankfully, than the Spanish flu pandemic. And the last reason to show you why I think that the COVID-19 pandemic will have only a minor impact on the future of longevity is showing that I'm not alone. Looking at what is the United Nations projecting in their world population prospects, what I mentioned already earlier, I slightly formatted the table from this methodological explanation, page 42, if you want to check it for yourself. And they were estimating in those 2002 revisions, when will life expectancy be back to pre-pandemic levels? Which year and how many years it will take? What they looked at are the following factors. The one is, how did life expectancy look like in 2020 compared to 2018-19, which they used as a reference, or statisticians like to call it a baseline, to which you compare things to. And they said, okay, we have a decline in life expectancy in 2020 compared to 2018 and 90. Or we see no decline. Then they looked at what has happened in the following year, 2021. Do we see even a further decline or just a decline? See we a partial recovery? or decline or no decline. As you can see, all those different possibilities are like a tree going out into different branches. And then they said, okay, let's also look at the vaccine coverage, the COVID-19 coverage, meaning what is the proportion of people who had one or more doses as of mid-May 2022? If I recall correctly, the World Population Prospects were published, the 2022 revision in July. And so I guess you have to make sooner or later some kind of cutoff date. And this was May 2022. Less than 25% of people had at least one or more COVID-19 vaccines, between a quarter and half or half and more. And then they are like listing all those various categories, like I said, all those branches from a tree. And they said, well, if you look at those numbers here, according to United Nations, how many years will it take for the life expectancy to return to pre-pandemic levels? And the highest value is actually 3. So by the year 2025, they expect even the worst countries in terms of like worst hit by the pandemic to be back on pre-pandemic levels or even earlier. So only if there's less than a quarter of the people were vaccinated, we saw a decline in 2020 compared to the reference, and a further decline in 2021, even in those rather unfortunate circumstances. The United Nations were expecting or are expecting that it takes at the maximum 3 years to come back to pre-pandemic levels. So let me quickly summarize my understanding, my idea. What I think is that the impact of the pandemic on longevity will be rather minor. And I hope I made it somehow clear on which reasons my reasoning, my idea is based on. Number one is the past experience in the case of the Spanish flu, which was much more severe, where the years preceding it in many countries, where the countries were hit by World War I, nevertheless, life expectancy quickly recovered to pre-pandemic levels at that time. So the past experiences, minor, thankfully. The past experience, a comparison with what happened nowadays, also shows the magnitude. You remember the figure here, if we superimpose the current results to the past results, you see that thankfully, the COVID-19 pandemic has been rather minor compared to the Spanish flu pandemic. And I think I'm not alone. That is reason number 3 I wanted to present. The projections of the United Nations, they think that the worst hit countries in their projections, because they want to forecast life expectancy until the year 2100, when can we go back to pre-pandemic development levels of life expectancy? And in the worst case, this is, according to them, the year 2025. So I hope you get an interesting idea why I think, or understanding why I think the impact of the pandemic on longevity will be minor, will be extremely limited. Thank you very much for sticking also with my module, this case study on the impact of the pandemic on longevity trends. Please stay also with us for the final parts of our module, of my module, where I will quickly summarize the key takeaways of my module and also give you some further reading if you're inclined to dig a little bit deeper. Thank you very much and see you in a second.